Hello and welcome. Tonight we're stepping away from the grand castles and royal courts to explore the lives of those who truly sustained medieval society, the peasants. While kings and knights shaped the battles and politics of the Middle Ages, it was the hard work of farmers, laborers, and villagers that kept the world running. But what was life really like for the people who toiled in the fields, lived under the rule of lords, and built the very foundation of medieval society? How did they survive harsh winters, poor harvests, and the weight of feudal obligations? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? And how did they find joy in a world that was often unforgiving? So sit back, relax, and let's journey into the everyday world of medieval peasants, where survival was a constant struggle, but life was filled with faith, resilience, and community. The world of medieval peasants, a harsh but vital existence. In the grand narrative of the Middle Ages, kings waged wars, knights upheld codes of honor, and castles stood as symbols of power. But beneath these towering structures and noble ambitions lay the true backbone of medieval society, the peasants. These men and women, bound to the land by birth and tradition, worked tirelessly to feed not only themselves, but the entire feudal system. Their world was one of hardship and endurance, shaped by the demands of the seasons, the authority of lords, and the ever-present influence of the church. Medieval society was structured under feudalism, a system in which land was the primary source of wealth and power. At the top of this hierarchy stood the king, followed by nobles and knights, who controlled vast estates. At the very bottom were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Though they were the ones who tilled the fields and produced the food that sustained society, they had little control over their own lives. Peasants fell into two primary categories: serfs and free peasants. Serfs were legally bound to the land they worked, unable to leave without the lord's permission. In return for protection and the right to cultivate small plots for themselves, they were required to labor on the lord's estate, pay taxes, and offer a portion of their harvest as rent. Free peasants, on the other hand, had more mobility and could own land, though they still owed service or taxes to their local lord. Regardless of status, nearly all peasants lived under the authority of a noble whose demands shaped their daily existence. Life in a medieval village revolved around the manor, the estate owned by the local lord. The manor house, often a modest fortified dwelling, stood as the center of power. Surrounding it were the peasant homes, small wooden or wattle-and daub structures with thatched roofs. These homes were simple and functional, with dirt floors, a single room for the entire family, and a central hearth for warmth and cooking. Livestock often shared the living space, particularly during winter, adding to the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Despite these hardships, medieval peasants found ways to build strong, interdependent communities. Village life was deeply communal, with families working together in the fields, celebrating religious festivals, and supporting one another in times of need. Social bonds were essential for survival, as no one could afford to live in isolation. The rhythm of life was dictated by the agricultural cycle, with planting in the spring, tending crops crops in the summer and harvesting in the fall. Work was grueling and leisure time was scarce. Most peasants toiled from sunrise to sunset, pausing only for meals and brief moments of rest. Women played a crucial role, not only working in the fields alongside men, but also managing households, preparing food, weaving cloth, and tending to children. Though their contributions were vital, they had little autonomy, and their lives were often dictated by the same harsh realities that govern men. Beyond their lords, the church was the most powerful force in a peasant's life. The medieval church was not just a religious institution, but a political and economic power that shaped every aspect of daily existence. Peasants were required to pay a tithe, or a tenth of their earnings, to the church, which controlled vast amounts of land. Clergy provided spiritual guidance, but also reinforced the social order, teaching that one's place in life was divinely ordained. Religious festivals, feast days, and church gatherings provided rare moments of respite and celebration, breaking the monotony of labor. Yet, while the church preached acceptance of one's lot in life, peasant uprisings were not uncommon. Heavy taxation, famine, and unjust treatment could push entire villages to rebellion. One of the most famous revolts was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, where thousands of laborers, led by figures like Wat Tyler, rose up against oppressive laws and taxes. Though most revolts were crushed, they revealed the underlying tensions and frustrations that simmered beneath the surface of feudal society. Despite their struggles, medieval peasants were not merely victims of their circumstances. They found joy in the simple pleasures of life: music, storytelling, festivals, and family bonds. They developed deep connections to their land, their traditions, and their faith. Their endurance, though often overlooked, was essential to the survival of medieval civilization. As we continue, we'll take a closer look at what daily life was like for these peasants, from their homes and families to the work that defined their existence. The next chapter will explore the manor system, where lords ruled and peasants labored, shaping the medieval world for centuries. Life on the manor, feudal duties and daily struggles. For medieval peasants, life revolved around the manor, the estate controlled by a local lord. The manor was more than just a piece of land. It was an entire system of governance, economy, and survival. It was here that peasants worked, paid dues, and lived under the strict expectations of feudal society. Though their world was small, its demands were immense, shaping their daily lives with relentless labor, rigid hierarchy, and a delicate balance of duty and survival. At the heart of the manor stood the manor house, home to the lord and his family. This building was often the largest in the village, sometimes fortified like a small castle. Surrounding it were the lands controlled by the lord: fields, pastures, forests, and the village itself. The manor also included a church, a mill, and sometimes a blacksmith's forge or a communal oven. These shared resources were essential, but using them often came at a price. Peasants were required to pay fees for grinding grain at the mill or baking bread in the lord's oven. peasants were divided into two primary classes: serfs and free peasants. Serfs were the backbone of the manor, legally bound to the land. They could not leave without permission, and their labor belonged to the lord. They worked not only their own plots, but also the lord's demesne, the portion of land reserved for his own profit. Free peasants, on the other hand, had more autonomy. They could own land, move freely, and even engage in trade, though they still owed taxes and service to the lord. Work on the manor followed the seasons. In spring, fields were plowed, seeds sown, and animals cared for. Summer meant constant labor in the fields, weeding and tending crops. Autumn was dominated by the harvest, a time of both urgency and celebration. Winter was the hardest season. Food was scarce, work was limited, and survival depended on careful preparation. Peasants worked from sunrise to sunset, their days dictated by the rhythms of nature. A typical peasant's day began at dawn. Men and older boys would head to the fields, plowing, planting, or harvesting, while women managed the home, prepared meals, cared for animals, and wove textiles. Children helped wherever needed, learning essential skills from a young age. At midday, a brief break allowed for a simple meal, usually bread, pottage, a vegetable stew, and ale. Work resumed until dusk, when families returned home, exhausted but bound together by necessity and shared hardship. In addition to farming, peasants were expected to provide other services to their lord. This could include repairing roads, maintaining fences, or assisting in building projects. Some were also required to serve as foot soldiers in times of war. Failure to meet these obligations often resulted in punishment, fines, or increased labor demands. Despite their hard lives, peasants found ways to build a sense of community and resilience. Religious festivals and feast days were among the few times when labor paused, allowing for gatherings, music, dancing, and moments of joy. Weddings, baptisms, and village celebrations brought brief but meaningful respite from their daily struggles. However, life on the manor was marked by strict hierarchy and control. The lord held legal authority over his peasants, acting as judge in local disputes and setting rules that governed everything from land use to marriages. Lords could be harsh or benevolent, depending on their character, but peasants had little power to challenge their rule. The church also played a key role, reinforcing social order and encouraging peasants to accept their place in life as part of God's divine plan. While feudal obligations kept peasants tied to their land, they were not entirely powerless. Some negotiated better conditions, fled to towns in search of freedom, or even participated in revolts when conditions became unbearable. The manor system provided structure and security, but it also kept peasants in a cycle of dependence and hardship. As we continue, we'll explore one of the most important aspects of peasant life: their food, diet, and how they sustain themselves in times of both abundance and scarcity. Farming and the rhythm of the seasons. For medieval peasants, survival depended on the land. Farming was not just a way of life, it was the foundation of society. The feudal system revolved around agriculture, and every peasant, whether free or bound as a serf, played a crucial role in ensuring that fields were planted, crops were harvested, and food was stored for the long winter months. Life was dictated by the changing seasons, each bringing new challenges and responsibilities. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one could mean starvation. The agricultural year was divided into 3 main periods: planting, growing, and harvesting. Each season required different tasks, and peasants had to work in harmony with nature to maximize their yields. Spring, renewal and hard labors. Winter loosened its grip. The village came to life. The first task of the year was plowing the fields. Using wooden plows, often drawn by oxen, peasants broke the hardened soil, preparing it for planting. Seeds for barley, oats, wheat, and rye were sown, and vegetable gardens were replanted. Spring was also the time for maintaining tools, fences, and cottages, ensuring everything was ready for the busy months ahead. Animals, too, required attention. Cows and sheep that had been kept in barns during winter were released to graze, and lambs, calves, and piglets were born. Peasants relied on these animals for meat, milk, wool, and leather. Their survival was just as crucial as the crops in the fields. Summer, the longest days, the hardest work. Summer was a time of constant labor. Fields had to be weeded, pests controlled, and crops tended to ensure a good harvest. The days were long, with peasants working from sunrise to sunset under the hot sun. Women and children often joined men in the fields, pulling weeds, gathering hay, and helping with livestock. It was also a time of haymaking. Grass was cut, dried, and stored to feed animals through the winter. Without enough hay, livestock would not survive, making this one of the most critical tasks of the year. Though summer was demanding, it was also a time of communal effort. Families worked together, and villagers supported one another, sharing tools and labor. Religious festivals and feast days, often tied to planting and fertility rites, provided rare moments of rest and celebration. Autumn, the harvest and the feast. The most important time of the year was the harvest. All the labor of spring and summer led to this moment, when fields of wheat, barley, and rye were finally reaped. Harvesting was a race against time. Bad weather could ruin an entire year's work. Peasants used sickles and scythes to cut the crops by hand. The grain was gathered and taken to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour. A portion of the harvest was set aside for taxes and tithes, with the Lord and the church taking their share, before peasants could keep what remained. After the harvest, some of the seeds were saved for next year's planting, ensuring the cycle could continue. The remaining grain was stored, protected from dampness and rodents. Vegetables like onions, cabbages, and turnips were also harvested and stored in root cellars. Despite the exhausting work, the harvest season ended with celebration. Peasants held feasts, dances, and festivals, giving thanks for the bounty of the land. It was a brief but cherished moment of joy before the hardships of winter returned. Winter, survival, and scarcity once. The fields were barren and the cold set in, life slowed. peasants turned to indoor tasks, repairing tools, weaving fabric, and making household items. Food supplies were carefully rationed. Bread, dried meats, root vegetables, and preserved fruits sustained them through the harsh months. For those who had worked hard and been fortunate, winter could be endured. But for those who had suffered a poor harvest or lost livestock, it was a time of hunger, sickness, and death. Cold and disease took their toll, and families relied on community support and charity from the church to survive. The cycle continues. Each new year brought fresh hopes and new struggles. The cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting repeated itself endlessly, binding peasants to the land and the rhythm of nature. Though their work was grueling and their existence fragile, their resilience ensured that society survived and thrived. As we continue, we'll explore one of the most fundamental aspects of peasant life: their food, diet, and how they sustained themselves through times of both plenty and scarcity. For medieval peasants, survival depended entirely on the land. Their lives were bound to the changing seasons, each bringing a new set of challenges and duties. Every year followed the same cycle: planting in the spring, tending to the fields in the summer, harvesting in the autumn, and enduring the hardships of winter. A good year meant survival. A bad one could mean starvation. With the arrival of spring, the village came to life after the long, harsh winter. The first task was plowing the fields, breaking up the hardened earth so that seeds could take root. Wooden plows, often drawn by oxen, turned the soil in preparation for wheat, barley, rye, and oats. Planting had to be done quickly, as the growing season was short and unpredictable. Weather could easily ruin the harvest. At the same time, peasants tended to their vegetable gardens, planting onions, leeks, cabbages, and beans, which would provide much-needed nourishment throughout the year. It was also the season of renewal for livestock. Cows, sheep, and pigs that had survived the winter were set out to graze, while new lambs and calves were born, ensuring the future of the herd. As spring turned to summer, the fields required constant attention. Weeds threatened to choke the crops, and pests could destroy an entire year's work if left unchecked. Long days of labor under the hot sun left peasants exhausted, but there was no room for rest. Women and children often joined in, helping with weeding, gathering hay for the animals, and tending to the chickens and pigs. The work was grueling, but it was also a time of communal effort. Families worked together, sharing tools and helping one another complete the tasks that would determine their survival in the months ahead. The arrival of autumn signaled the most crucial period of the year: the harvest. Everything depended on this moment. Men, women, and children took to the fields with sickles and scythes, cutting grain by hand and bundling it into sheaves. It was back-breaking work, but there was a sense of urgency and purpose. If the weather turned bad before the crops were gathered, an entire village could face famine. Once harvested, the grain was taken to the local mill, where it was ground into flour. A portion of the harvest was always set aside as payment to the Lord and the Suya church, leaving peasants with whatever remained. Some of the grain was stored for the winter, while another portion was saved to be planted the following spring, ensuring that the cycle could continue. Despite the exhaustion, the end of the harvest brought a rare moment of celebration. After months of toil, the village came together for feasts and festivals, marking the completion of the most critical task of the year. There was dancing, music, and communal meals, a brief but treasured respite before the hardships of winter returned. As the cold set in, life on the manor slowed. With the fields barren, peasants turned to indoor tasks, repairing tools, weaving cloth, and making simple household goods. Food supplies were carefully rationed, as the months ahead would be lean. Bread, dried meats, salted fish, and stored vegetables provided sustenance, but hunger was always a looming threat. For those who had suffered a poor harvest, winter was a time of desperation. Without enough grain, they were forced to rely on whatever scraps they could find, begging for help from neighbors or the church. Sickness spread easily in the cold months, and many did not survive until spring. Through it all, the cycle continued. When the frost finally melted and the first signs of new growth appeared, the peasants would once again take to the fields, repeating the labor that defined their existence. Their connection to the land was unbreakable, their survival entirely dependent on the success of their crops and livestock. Though they lived under the rule of lords and the demands of the church, it was their toil that sustained the entire medieval world. As we continue, we'll explore one of the most fundamental aspects of peasant life: their food, diet, and the struggle to sustain themselves through times of both abundance and scarcity. Food was the foundation of survival for medieval peasants, yet it was often scarce, simple, and repetitive. Their diet depended entirely on what they could grow, gather, or trade, and every meal was shaped by the seasons. Unlike the nobility, who enjoyed lavish feasts with roasted meats and exotic spices, peasants lived on a diet of basic grains, vegetables, and whatever small amounts of protein they could obtain. Bread was the staple of every meal, and its quality varied depending on wealth and harvest conditions. Those who could afford it ate wheat bread, but for most, coarser loaves made from rye, barley, or oats were the norm. In years of bad harvests, desperate peasants would mix whatever they could find: acorns, ground beans, even tree bark, into their dough to make it stretch further. Alongside bread, a thick vegetable stew called pottage was a daily meal, made by simmering whatever was available: cabbage, onions, leeks, carrots, beans, or herbs. It was left cooking over the hearth throughout the day, providing warmth and sustenance. Meat was a rare luxury, as livestock were too valuable to be slaughtered frequently. Most protein came from eggs, cheese, or occasional scraps of bacon and salted fish. Hunting was restricted by law. Forests and game belonged to the lord, and poaching was harshly punished. Some peasants, however, risked setting traps for rabbits or birds, knowing that being caught could mean severe fines or even imprisonment. Dairy products played a crucial role in the peasant diet, though they were far less refined than what they aimed to say. Nobility consumed milk, often from goats rather than cows, was used to make cheese, which could be stored for long periods. Butter was valuable, though in many places it was reserved for special occasions. Ale, rather than water, was the most common drink, since clean water was difficult to find and unsafe to drink in many areas. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed at home and consumed daily. It provided both hydration and nutrition, as it was made from fermented grains. Even children drank it, as it was far less intoxicating than stronger brews. Fasting and religious observances significantly influenced the diet. The church imposed many restrictions on eating habits, particularly forbidding meat consumption on certain days. Fish, however, was permitted, which made it a prize food for those living near rivers or the sea. Inland villages relied on salted or dried fish, though it was often expensive and difficult to obtain. During Lent and other religious fasting periods, peasant meals became even more restricted, consisting mainly of bread, vegetables, and legumes. Feast days, though rare, brought a welcome break from the usual monotony. Weddings, religious celebrations, and harvest festivals were occasions where food was shared more freely. A well-off village might prepare roasted pigs or geese, while poorer communities made do with extra servings of bread, cheese, and pottage. Ale flowed more freely. Music and dancing replaced toil, and for a brief time peasants could forget their daily struggles. Despite these occasional moments of abundance, food insecurity was a constant threat. A single failed harvest could lead to famine, forcing entire villages to survive on dwindling stores of grain and whatever they could forage from the land. In the worst years, peasants ate roots, nuts, and even boiled bark to stave off hunger. Starvation was not uncommon, and during prolonged periods of scarcity, disease followed closely behind, preying on the weak and malnourished. Through it all, peasants remained resilient, adapting to the land and making the most of what they had. Their ability to survive on the simplest of foods, to stretch every resource, and to endure the hardships of an unpredictable world was a testament to their strength. While their meals were humble, they sustained not only themselves, but the entire medieval economy. Without their labor, the fields would remain unplowed, the grain unharvested, and the world unfed. As we continue, we'll step inside the homes of medieval peasants, exploring how they lived, raised their families, and found warmth in a world that often seemed cold and unforgiving. For medieval peasants, home was not just a place of shelter, but the center of their entire existence. Their houses were simple, built from the materials available in their surroundings: wood, mud, straw, and stone. Unlike the grand castles and fortified manors of the nobility, peasant homes were small, dark, and often shared with livestock. Yet, despite their modest size, these dwellings served as the heart of family life, where meals were cooked, children were raised, and the struggles of daily labor gave way to moments of rest and companionship. Most peasant homes were single-room structures, with walls made of wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches covered in a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The roofs were thatched with dried grass or reeds, offering some insulation against the elements but little protection from leaks or infestations. The floors were typically made of packed earth, sometimes covered with straw to soften the surface and absorb moisture. There were no proper chimneys. Smoke from the central hearth simply drifted through a small hole in the roof or out of cracks in the walls. This filled the home with soot, making breathing difficult and leaving a layer of black grime on everything inside. Furnishings were sparse, consisting of a wooden table, a few benches, and straw mattresses for sleeping. Most peasants did not own proper beds. Instead, families huddled together on piles of hay, covered with coarse wool blankets or animal skins for warmth. In winter, livestock, chickens, goats, and even pigs were brought inside at night, providing additional heat and protecting them from thieves or predators. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, and families lived in close quarters, often sharing their homes with extended relatives. The hearth was the center of peasant life. Suspended over the fire, an iron pot was used to cook pottage, while flat stones were heated to bake simple bread. The fire provided warmth, light, and a space for storytelling after the long workday. Without glass windows, homes had only small, wooden shutters that could be opened for light or closed to keep out the cold. Candles, made from animal fat, were expensive and used sparingly, meaning most peasants relied on the fire for illumination. Women played a crucial role in maintaining the household. Their day began before sunrise, tending to chores such as grinding grain, baking bread, spinning wool, and weaving cloth. They were responsible for raising children, managing livestock, and preserving food for the winter months. Despite their tireless labor, they held little power within the household or community, their lives dictated by both tradition and necessity. Children were expected to contribute from a young age, assisting with household tasks and field work as soon as they were able. There was little time for formal education. Instead, they learned skills essential for survival by watching their parents and older siblings. Boys trained to handle farming tools, herd animals, and repair structures, while girls learned to cook, sew, and tend to younger siblings. Though their lives were hard, moments of play were not entirely absent. Games, simple toys, and village festivals provided occasional relief from daily routines. Despite the hardships, peasant homes were places of resilience and community. Villages functioned as close-knit societies where neighbors supported one another, sharing tools, food, and labor when needed. Births, weddings, and religious celebrations brought rare moments of joy, strengthening the bonds between families. The church played an essential role in home life, offering guidance, marking the passage of time with feast days, and providing a sense of purpose amid the struggles of daily existence. While peasant homes lacked the grandeur and comfort of noble estates, they were filled with the warmth of family, the rhythm of hard work, and the determination to survive. They were more than just buildings. They were the heart of medieval life, where generations endured, adapted, and carried forward the traditions that defined their world. As we continue, we'll explore the labor that shaped these villages beyond the fields, craftsmen, tradesmen, and the bustling markets where peasants exchanged goods and services. Beyond the fields and homes of medieval peasants life extended into the workshops and marketplaces that sustained the village economy. While farming was the backbone of survival, not every peasant spent their days tilling the land. Some worked as craftsmen producing essential goods, while others participated in local trade, exchanging what little they had for items they could not make themselves. The village was a world of interdependent labor, where survival depended not only on harvests, but also on the skills and cooperation of the community. Each village had a small number of craftsmen who specialized in various trades. The blacksmith was among the most crucial, forging tools, horseshoes, nails, and even simple weapons. His workshop, usually located near the center of the village, was a place of constant activity, with the sound of hammers striking metal ringing through the air. The carpenter shaped wood into furniture, carts, and wheels, while the potter molded clay into cooking vessels and storage jars. These artisans were often peasants themselves, splitting their time between their craft and the toiled demands of farming. Women played a significant role in producing textiles. Weaving, spinning, and dyeing were essential skills, as fabric was needed for clothing, blankets, and sacks. Wool from sheep was spun into thread, which was then woven into coarse cloth. Dyes made from plants, berries, and minerals added color, though most peasant clothing remained in natural shades of brown, gray, and dull green. Shoes were rare for the poorest villagers, but those who could afford them wore simple leather shoes, often made within the village. Most villages had a communal mill, usually controlled by the local lord. Peasants brought their grain to be ground into flour, paying a portion of it as a fee. The mill was vital, as hand-grinding grain with a mortar and pestle was time-consuming and inefficient. However, peasants often resented the fees, and some secretly ground their grain at home to avoid the extra cost, despite the risk of punishment. Trade in medieval villages was limited but essential. Peasants rarely had coins, so barter was the primary form of exchange. A farmer might trade sacks of grain for a pair of boots, or a weaver might exchange cloth for firewood. Markets held weekly or seasonally in larger towns provided opportunities to buy goods that were not available in the village, such as salt, iron tools, or imported cloth. Traveling merchants occasionally visited, bringing rare items like spices, fine textiles, or even books, though these were luxuries far beyond the reach of most peasants. Festivals and fairs brought a rare sense of excitement to village life. These events, often tied to religious holidays, were not just opportunities for celebration, but also for trade. Craftsmen displayed their wares, farmers brought livestock to sell, and entertainers, jugglers, musicians, or storytellers, provided distractions from the hardships of daily life. These gatherings were moments of both economic and social importance, strengthening the bonds within and between communities. Despite the structured economy of village life, hardship was never far away. A failed harvest, a sudden storm, or a war between lords could disrupt trade and plunge families into poverty. Taxes and fees imposed by both the lord and the church took their toll, leaving many peasants struggling to hold on to what little they had. Still, they endured, relying on their skills, their families, and their communities to survive in an unforgiving world. As we continue, we'll explore the spiritual side of medieval peasant life, examining the deep influence of the church and how faith shaped every aspect of their existence. Faith was at the very center of medieval peasant life. The church was not just a place of worship, but a powerful institution that influenced every aspect of existence, from birth to death. It provided spiritual guidance, enforced social order, and shaped the rhythms of daily life. For a peasant, religion was not an abstract belief. It was woven into the very fabric of survival, offering both comfort and control in a world filled with hardship and uncertainty. Every village had its church, often the largest and most well-built structure in the area, made of stone or wood, with a simple bell tower. It stood as a constant presence in the lives of the people. The local priest, usually one of the few literate members of the community, served as both a spiritual leader and an authority figure. He conducted mass, recorded births and deaths, and mediated disputes. Though many priests were poor like the peasants they served, they still represented the immense power of the church, an institution that owned vast lands and collected tithes from even the most impoverished villagers. The church dictated much of a peasant's daily routine. The day began with the ringing of the church bell, marking the time for morning prayers. Sundays were sacred, a day of rest when all work ceased and families gathered for Mass. Religious feast days, scattered throughout the year, provided rare breaks from labor, celebrating saints, holy events, and the changing seasons. These festivals were a mix of solemn rituals and joyous gatherings, with processions, plays, and feasts offering a temporary escape from hardship. Tithes were a mandatory tax, requiring peasants to give a portion of their harvest, typically 10%, to the church. This payment in grain, livestock, or goods ensured that the clergy remained well-fed even in times of famine. Many peasants resented this burden, especially when they saw monks and bishops living in relative comfort. Yet refusing to pay was unthinkable. Failure to comply risked not just fines, but spiritual condemnation. Faith was also deeply tied to superstition. While the church taught Christian doctrine, peasants still clung to older folk beliefs, blending them into their religious practices. Holy relics were believed to hold miraculous powers, and pilgrimages to sacred sites were undertaken in hopes of divine favor. Many villagers carried charms or sought blessings from the priest to protect their homes and livestock from misfortune. The fear of divine punishment was ever present, and natural disasters, poor harvests, or plagues were often seen as signs of God's anger. Death was a central concern in peasant life, and the church played a crucial role in preparing the soul for the afterlife. Funerals were solemn occasions, marked by prayers and offerings to ensure safe passage to heaven. The fear of purgatory, a place of temporary suffering for those who had not fully atoned for their sins, was deeply ingrained. Peasants were encouraged to give alms, perform good deeds, and seek the church's blessing to reduce their time in the afterlife's waiting room. Despite its power, the church was not beyond criticism. When times were good, faith provided strength and unity, but in times of famine, war, or plague, resentment grew. Some questioned why the clergy lived in relative ease while peasants starved. Others, particularly in later centuries, would challenge the church's authority outright. But for most, faith remained a source of stability, offering hope in a world where suffering was an unavoidable part of life. As we continue, we'll explore the darker side of medieval peasant life, disease, famine, and the constant battle for survival against forces beyond their control. Life for medieval peasants was filled with hardship, but nothing was more devastating than famine, disease, and war. These were unpredictable disasters that could wipe out entire villages, leaving survivors struggling to rebuild. Unlike the steady rhythms of farming and daily labor, these threats came suddenly, turning an already difficult existence into a desperate fight for survival. Hunger was a constant challenge, but true famine was far worse. A poor harvest meant scarcity, but consecutive failures could lead to disaster. Heavy rains, droughts, or an unexpected frost could destroy crops, leaving little to eat. When grain became scarce, prices rose beyond what most peasants could afford. Families stretched their food supplies as far as possible, eating whatever they could find: roots, acorns, even the bark of trees. Malnutrition weakened the body, making people more vulnerable to illness. The weakest, especially children and the elderly, suffered the most. Disease was another ever-present danger, spreading quickly through crowded villages. Simple infections that are easily treated today could be fatal. Poor sanitation made matters worse, as drinking water was often contaminated and homes were shared with livestock. Common illnesses such as dysentery and fevers could spread quickly, leaving many too weak to work. Without medicine, people relied on herbal remedies, prayers, and the hope that their strength would return. The most feared sickness came in the mid-14th century with the arrival of the Black Death. This terrible disease spread rapidly, moving from town to town, striking without warning. It brought high fever, painful swellings, and severe weakness. Entire families fell ill, and in some places half the population was lost. Panic spread as people searched for answers, but no one understood what caused the sickness. Villages were abandoned, and those who survived faced an empty world, where fields lay untended and homes stood silent. Beyond hunger and illness, war was another force that shaped peasant life. Lords and kings fought for land and power, but it was the villagers who suffered most. Armies raided the countryside, taking food, burning homes, and forcing people to flee. Farmers who had spent months tending their crops could lose everything in a single day. With little protection, they could only hope that war would pass quickly and spare their families. Rebuilding after such hardships was slow and difficult. Fields had to be replanted, homes repaired, and communities restored. Some villages never recovered, left abandoned as people moved in search of a better life. Yet, despite everything peasants endured, they found ways to rebuild, to adapt, and to continue on. Each disaster left its mark, but it also shaped the resilience that defined their lives. As we continue, we'll explore moments when peasants fought back, not against nature, but against the very system that kept them bound to the land. For most of the Middle Ages, peasants lived under the authority of lords, bound by strict laws and heavy duties. Their place in society was seen as fixed, dictated by tradition and reinforced by the church. Yet there were moments when they resisted, when hunger, unfair taxes, or harsh treatment pushed them to the breaking point. Though rebellion was rare and dangerous, some peasants risked everything to fight for better conditions, challenging the very system that ruled their lives. One of the most famous uprisings occurred in England in 1381, known as the Peasants' Revolt. Years of war, high taxes, and economic hardship had made life unbearable. A new poll tax, requiring every person to pay the same amount, regardless of wealth, was the final blow. Angry villagers gathered under leaders like Wat Tyler and John Ball, demanding lower taxes and fairer treatment. Thousands marched to London, storming government buildings and forcing the king to listen. For a brief moment, it seemed as if change was possible. In France, peasant uprisings, known as the Jacquerie, broke out in the 14th century. Years of war had left the countryside in ruins, and peasants, tired of suffering, rose against the nobility. They attacked castles, burned estates, and tried to take back control of their lives. However, like many revolts, it was quickly and violently crushed, with thousands killed in retaliation. While large-scale rebellions often failed, smaller acts of resistance were common. Some peasants refused to pay taxes or secretly ground their own grain instead of using the lord's mill. Others ran away to towns, seeking freedom from feudal obligations. In cities, former serfs could sometimes gain legal status after a year and a day of residence, offering a rare path to independence. Over time, these struggles contributed to slow but lasting change. By the late Middle Ages, the feudal system was weakening. The Black Death had reduced the population, making labor more valuable. Lords, desperate for workers, had to offer better conditions, and many peasants gained more freedom as a result. In some regions, serfdom began to disappear, replaced by tenant farming and wage labor. Peasants were not powerless figures trapped in hardship. They endured, adapted, and when necessary, resisted. Though history often remembers kings and nobles, the strength and persistence of those who worked the land shaped the world just as much. As we conclude this journey into the lives of medieval peasants, we are left with a picture of resilience. Their world was one of hardship, but also of community, faith, and quiet determination. Without them, the great castles, cities, and kingdoms of the Middle Ages could not have existed. Their story is one of survival, a reminder that history is not only made by rulers, but by those who build, toil, and endure. We have now reached the conclusion of our journey through the world of medieval peasants. From the struggles of daily labor to the rhythms of the seasons, from the hardships of famine and war to moments of quiet resistance, their lives were shaped by forces both natural and man-made. Though often overlooked in grand historical narratives, these men and women were the foundation of medieval society. Without their toil in the fields, their craftsmanship in the villages, and their resilience in times of crisis, the castles, cities, and kingdoms of the Middle Ages could not have survived. Peasants endured lives of hardship, yet they were not passive victims of their circumstances. They found joy in festivals, strength in faith, and solidarity in their communities. They built homes, raised families, and passed down traditions that would shape the future. And when pushed beyond their limits, they resisted, demanding better conditions and in some cases helping to bring about the gradual decline of feudalism itself. As the medieval world changed, so did the role of the peasantry. The Black Death, economic shifts, and the rise of towns and trade altered the structure of society. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom was fading in many parts of Europe, replaced by new systems of labor and land ownership. Though still tied to the land, peasants gained more autonomy, slowly carving out a place for themselves in a world that had once seemed unchangeable. Their legacy lives on not just in history books, but in the very landscapes they cultivated, the villages that grew from their efforts, and the traditions passed down through generations. They were the quiet force behind medieval civilization, proving that even those with the least power could shape the course of history through endurance, work, and an unbreakable spirit. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the lives of medieval peasants. Their story, though often untold, is one of resilience, survival, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.